Thank you, James. So the data for this is all collected by Carla Torres Pereira, who's a PhD student from Portugal, who was working in this group, in our group in Cambridge, and she's in fact now living in Santiago de Chile, and so she couldn't come and give the paper herself, so I'm doing it for her. And the two areas that we decided we would talk about, two studies we thought we would talk about, are firstly one in which we're asking the question, can dogs have a concept of right and wrong? And then a second one in which, with a somewhat similar experimental design, in which we're actually looking at what are the consequences in terms of behavior and heart rate when a dog is reunited with an owner after an obedience task, and to ask whether the performance of the task is altered by the presence or absence of the owner. And the subjects in the first study were 32 pet dogs who we got by advertising in a university newsletter, and the second are 16 dogs which had been which were really quite well trained and which were part of a working with a dog trainer and part of a training program, but they're still all pet dogs. And we measured behavior and we measured heart rate, or I should say Carla did these things and I just looked at the results. And so you see here's a room, and here is an owner with a dog. In this case, this one's in a wheelchair, but most of them weren't. And then we put a polar heart rate monitor on the animals, and this was done well in advance so that they got used to it. And in the first study, all of these dogs which were used in the study, they were going to be told in relation to an object, either a toy or an item of food, leave it or off. And so these were all animals which were familiar with those instructions. They'd had those instructions before. And the owner then placed the object, gave the instruction, leave it, left the room for 30 seconds, and then came back again. And we were monitoring the animal during that time to see what happened. So here you can see there's a toy, there's a bit of chicken, and the animal is confronted with that, and we then monitor what happens when after the owner has given the instruction. And we were very concerned to control as accurately as we could the behavior of the owner when the owner came back. So the owner did not reprimand the dog, whatever the dog had done. The owner was completely silent. The owner kept an impassive face. So we asked the owner to do those things, which they all succeeded in doing. And we had two categories. One where the owner looked at the table and looked at the dog, and the other category, indifferent, where the owner just looked straight ahead and didn't look at either the dog or the table. And we had the dogs were subjected to each of these conditions, and we had a pattern so that all animals experienced all of these different conditions. So there was the toy, the food, and the owner indifferent or looking. So the first result is the response of the dog to the command, and there was no heart rate change when this command was given. The heart rate was not altered by giving that command. And then the behavior of the dog after the owner had left, 13 out of 32 dogs took the item of food. 5 out of 32 dogs took the toy after being instructed not to. And therefore we were interested in particular in the ones which did what they were told not to do. And if the dog took the object, then when we compared with the heart rate of the dog, 10 seconds before it took the object, or the toy, either the toy or the food item, 10 seconds before against 10 seconds after, there was an increase in heart rate. So the heart rate increased when the animal took the thing that it was supposed not to take. And the amount of movement involved in this was extremely small. So this was not an amount of movement which in itself would lead to an increase in heart rate. This is not a consequence of the movement of the animal, it's a consequence of what the animal has actually done. And then if we compared the dogs which had taken the object with dogs which hadn't, the dogs which had taken the object had a higher heart rate than the dogs which hadn't taken the object. So when it did the thing it wasn't supposed to do, there was a difference in heart rate, and there was also an effect on the behavior of the dog when the owner came back. So when the owner came back, if the dog had not taken the object, then 2/3 of the dogs showed this behavior where they looked alternately at the object, which they hadn't taken, and at the owner. And when you see it, you feel that the dog is communicating, look, I didn't take it, I didn't take it. So, sorry for that, but that's how one felt. What one felt the dog was communicating to the owner. So 31 out of 46 occasions that happened. And when the dog did take the object, they generally didn't look at the owner. They didn't look at the object. So there was a difference, a significant difference in the behavior. The animals which had done the thing that they were told not to do showed a different behavior from the ones which had done what as they were instructed. None of these dogs at any time showed submissive behavior when the owner came back. Whether they'd taken it or not, they didn't do it. When we looked at the two situations where the owner was looking at the dog on the table, or the owner was just looking straight ahead, there was no difference between those. The dog behavior and the dog heart rate seemed at that point to be just dependent on what the dog itself had done, not on these two behaviors of the owner. And then another study was done in which the owner, then we looked at what happened when the owner reprimanded a dog for doing something wrong. When the owner reprimanded the dog, whatever it was about, the dog was almost always showing some degree of submissive behavior. So the response to the reprimand was submissive behavior, or that was one of the responses to the reprimand. Whereas the dogs which had disobeyed and not being reprimanded didn't do that. And then we also had a comparison with exactly the same study, but in which the owner remained in the room. In that case, not many dogs took the object, took the toy or took the food, and there wasn't an effect on the heart rate, but it's a rather small sample. Okay, so what we conclude from this is that dogs seem to have concepts about the information that they have on the instruction for the owner. What they do, they have some concepts about their own actions because their subsequent behavior and heart rate indicates that. And probably, based on their previous experience, they have some expectations of what might happen when the owner comes back. They are expecting perhaps some behavior from the owner, and their response then to these concepts that they have are having an effect on the behavior and on the physiology. So all of you can see that I've gone through this so far without using the word guilt, but this is the kind of circumstance where if humans did this, we would use the word guilt. And so what's guilt? Well, guilt is a feeling of individuals who behave in a way which they or their social group would condemn or punish. And so why should guilt occur? Feeling guilty, I would say, is an adaptive feeling to have. It makes it more difficult to forget or ignore an action which has been in some way cheating on yourself and the world around you. And guilt could indeed motivate a cheater to compensate later for the transgression, and this could be beneficial in the long run, might mean indeed that it doesn't get expelled from a social group, say. And guilt then is something which affirms the biologically based moral standards of individuals. So guilt is something which is useful. Sometimes people distinguish the term guilt from the term shame. So in the summary of the results we've got in relation to that, so if the owner is absent and the dog does something wrong, you get an increase in heart rate. Maybe the dog has a concept that it's done something wrong. It may be that it has expectations about what the owner will do when the owner comes back. And we can't distinguish between these two. Indeed, I'm not absolutely sure we can distinguish conceptually in terms of what guilt really means. When the owner returns, the dog that's taken the object showed different behaviour, didn't look at the owner or the table, and this occurred whether or not the owner was looking at the dog and the table. But when reprimanded, the dogs showed different, submissive behaviour, and so dog behaviour in this test isn't a response to what the owner is doing. It's more of a response to what the dog itself has done, and perhaps to what the dog expects might happen, and to what the dog is feeling. And perhaps they're not looking at the owner, and this heart rate increase are an indication of a feeling of guilt. Okay, now another study, a second study, which has similarities with the first one. Dogs told to either sit, stay, or stand, stay. They are put in a situation where the owner gives them the instruction and then walks away from them. And in some cases, the owner went outside the room. In other cases, the owner stayed within sight and walked back towards the dogs later. So here's an owner who has walked away 8 paces and is standing after giving the instruction, sit, stay, or stand, stay. And here's an owner giving an instruction who then walks out of the room. And again, balanced within subject and between subject design. And I'll just rapidly give you some results from this. So these 2 commands, sit, stay, and stand, stay, elicited a similar obedience response from the dogs. And yes, and it didn't affect the dog's heart rate. These are all well-trained dogs. They're familiar with having this kind of instruction. The second result is that the dogs where the owner was within sight were much more likely to obey the instruction than the ones where the owner was out of sight. In fact, 14 out of 16 disobeyed when the owner went out of the room. We think this is a more difficult task for the dog. That is, sit, stay is harder than leave it as a conceptual thing. But in this case, we couldn't actually analyse the heart rate as we did in the previous study. So we're focusing here on what is the response of the dog when the owner goes out and when the owner comes back again. And the heart rates were higher when the owner was out of sight, and the dog's heart rates were also higher than that when the owner returned. So this is just comparing just before the owner returned with just after the owner returned, and for all 32 together, or if you separate the within sight ones and the out of sight ones, there's a significant increase in heart rate when the owner returns. So dogs are responding to owners coming back. So dogs were more likely to disobey when the owner was out of the room, and this was true for both studies, and it fits with the idea of dogs looking at attentive owners, getting information from the attentive state of the owner, and that a facing owner is different from an owner who's looking the other way. A reunion with the owner originated a similar emotional response, whether the owner had left the room or was just coming back after moving 8 paces away. Heart rates were higher in the out-of-sight episodes, both before and after reunion with the owner. And so we think this gives us a bit of information about what happens when reunion occurs after a period of separation. And overall, what we would say is that dogs' emotional responses after an obedience task are affected by their own actions, and they're affected by the presence of the owner. So we acknowledge the funders, we acknowledge our colleagues in Cambridge, in particular I would mention Anthony Podbasek and Irene Rocklitz, who are both here, and all the dog owners who helped us, and all the dogs. Thank you very much.